Patrick Vallance, one of the government's most senior advisors during the COVID pandemic. Mr. Next slide, please, is giving evidence to the UK's public COVID inquiry. Joining me right now is Carl Heneghan. He's Professor of Evidence-Based Medicine at the University of Oxford. He's also given evidence to the COVID inquiry. Though, Carl, I think you had rather less time than Sir Patrick Vallance is getting today, and perhaps weren't treated with quite the same sort of levels of courtesy and respect at the time as well. What has Sir Patrick had to say that's newsworthy so far, if anything?
Well, you're right. He's got all day today. He's had a lengthy introduction, and now they're just into the early issues and the decision-making. He's getting a very gentle time of it. Not many questions about what the evidence is, whether things work. Where we're at the stage now is, should we have locked down earlier? And so we're starting to learn that Sir Patrick was basically on the side of the modelling was very clear. I support what the modelling says, and we should have locked down earlier. He's also alluded to the fact is actually in March, it was just a question of implementation. Is in September, I think, and October, November, he's going to say we should have locked down even earlier then. So I think what we've learned in these early exchanges is getting a nice time. We've learned that he's focusing on the modelling and using that modelling as the approach was correct for Sir Patrick. And also, we should have just locked down earlier. Yeah. And we're going to see this afternoon, September and October, we should have probably locked down even earlier.
Yeah, I mean, this is the ongoing theme, isn't it? It does seem to me that there's nothing about this inquiry that says, let's work out, were lockdowns a good idea at all? Should they have happened? How should they have happened? Why did they happen? When should they have happened? The debate seems to be almost entirely two things. Who said nasty words about whom? How dysfunctional, the politicians, the aides were. And the other thing seems to be, how much sooner should we have lockdown to save lives? These seem to be such closed questions, very different from the public inquiries we've seen in countries like Sweden, very different kind, much quicker public inquiry, Denmark and other countries actually looking into this. Instead of looking at, was this the right thing to do? Was it right to change all pandemic planning in mid-March 2020 and to go for a different policy, given that the country that didn't, the control sample, Sweden, they stuck with the pandemic planning, which was what we were told by Sir Patrick Vallance and Professor Chris Whitty, who's going to give evidence tomorrow. We were told by them, they did it on camera in those press conferences in early March 2020 when they told us we shouldn't be locking down. It wasn't what we were going to do. We were going to close schools. It wouldn't make a difference. The vast majority of people were going to get this disease. You can't stop a virus. Some people are going to die, but the vast majority will get poorly and then they'll get better and they'll be fine. I mean, literally everything they said to us in those early March 2020 press conferences was exactly, A, what we should have carried on doing, and B, what we eventually know now as well. That information was there at the time. But there seems to be no debate at this COVID inquiry about why they changed policy, why they thought and why they still think now, despite all the evidence, that there was a reason to change policy and to lock us in our homes.
So I've been thinking about the concept, Julie, of how do we actually learn lessons? We learn lessons because either we accept that we've made some mistakes, and in understanding those mistakes, we reflect on them and say, here's how we do it differently next time. Or second, we look at the evidence and the information on the decisions we made and try and understand whether they were right ones or wrong. Well, both of those things seem to be out the window because, number one, everybody's blaming everybody else. It wasn't me, it was them. Mm. And what's happening here is the chief scientific advisor is saying it was the policy. And I'm sure when we get to Boris and Rishi, they'll say it was the scientist. Yeah. So that's out the window. And then second is, it is clear that the evidence that the decisions were made on is also not part of this inquiry. So the question for me, and I think the big question is, how do we actually learn any lessons apart from the government was in disarray, nobody liked each other, it was dysfunctional, and when anybody spoke, I mean, we just heard they were incandescent with rage. And I'm like, how does that work if you're in a meeting with somebody and you're incandescent? You're like, well, we're stopping listening to each other. Yeah. And I think that's also key. When people are blaming other people or calling them names, what they're trying to do is deflect from their own insecurities, if you like, and try not to be blamed. And I think this is a huge issue for us. How do we actually learn any lessons?
Yeah. Absolutely. It seemed to me from what we've heard so far that actually everyone in government has been, preparing to put their own defence, as you say, cover their own backsides. Sir Patrick Vallance earlier on, but saying he never expected his diaries to be made public. Really? there's a once in a century pandemic, and you wrote a diary, you're one of the main people involved in that decision making. You didn't think there was going to be a public inquiry and your private diaries might be made public, but also they've all decided who the scapegoat is. Now, as much as I do not hold a candle for this man, I do not believe that Matt Hancock is responsible for everything that went on in lockdown. There were many other people. Prime Minister Boris Johnson at the time, Michael Gove, who chaired virtually every major sub-cabinet meeting about the decision-making process, and others. The idea that we're all just going to basically all agree, let's all put the knife into Matt Hancock, and then he can take the blame, and we get off scot-free, and we can all have our knighthoods and go on to a better job somewhere. That seems to me to be fundamentally dishonest.
So number one is, you're right. Well, I'm on to my 16th health secretary now, Julia. And as they come into the post, you have to accept they know very little about healthcare. So it's key they rely on the advice they get. And that advice is central to some of the decision making. It's also interesting and key to me is within that advice structure, it seems that people don't like opposing views or dissent or criticism. It's almost like they want to be seen to be right. And I think that's a key issue for this pandemic and the inquiry, is to say, to what extent did you get balanced viewpoints in the room, opposing views? They call it red teaming. Margaret Thatcher was really hot on red teaming because she said, I want to test this and road test it with alternative views.
And that was something that people like you, Sunetra Gupta and others were trying to do. We'll have to leave it there, but Carl Heneghan, I know you'll be joining us again to talk about what's been happening